tremendous experience in innovation, strategic communication and planning, and creating security through international interagency and public-private partnerships. He has been simply an outstanding leader for the school. We are delighted that he is at Tufts to help prepare the next generation of leaders in public service, non-governmental organizations, and business. The students he is helping to educate will play critical roles in shaping and implementing our nation's future diplomatic and military policies. It's an inspired choice and a wonderful recipient for the Jean Mayer Award, and I know that his keynote will be thoughtful and engaging. Before the program begins, I want to give a special thanks to the Bendinson family. They are wonderful friends of Tufts and IGL. The symposium was endowed since 2004 by Bobby and Joanne, who are here in the front row, in honor of Bobby's parents, Norris and Marjorie Bendinson. And mostly important, I want to thank the EPIIC students, which are mostly Tufts undergraduates. We do have a Fletcher Mold student who's also involved. Thank you for all the hard work that you've done to develop this forum. I know that's a special part of this, the fact that you have been the ones who have thought about these issues, organized, and helped invite this tremendous host of speakers. So congratulations to all of you. I look forward to this session, and I'll try to get back this afternoon and tomorrow as well. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and welcome again to the 32nd Annual Norris and Marjorie Bendinson EPIIC International Symposium. This morning we have the privilege of hearing Dean James Stavridis speak about 21st century security challenges. But first, I have the honor of presenting Dean Stavridis with the Dr. Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award. Dr. Jean Mayer, a world-renowned nutritionist, was advisor to 3 U.S. presidents, the U.S. Senate, the U.S. Congress, the World Health Organization, the United Nations Children's Fund, the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, and the Secretary of State. He was awarded 14 decorations for his service in World War II and truly strove to effect positive change in the world. He was the first scientist to speak out against the use of herbicides in the Vietnam War. He led a mission to Biafra to assess health and nutrition conditions, and a year later organized an international symposium on famine, which produced the first ever document outlining how nutrition and relief operations should be organized in time of disaster. He was the first to suggest that the use of starvation as a political tool should be outlawed as a violation of human rights. Dr. Jean Mayer, the 10th president of Tufts University, certainly was a man whose life and career were, in the words of President Jimmy Carter, dedicated to the service of mankind. The Dr. Jean Mayer Global Citizenship Award was established in 1993 in honor of Jean Mayer to challenge and inspire students in the community by honoring distinguished scholars and practitioners whose moral courage, personal integrity, and passion for scholarship embody his dictum that scholarship, research, and teaching must be dedicated to solving the problems facing the world. Dean Stavridis certainly embodies this dictum. Having achieved the rank of 4-star admiral, he was the first naval officer to command the U.S. Southern Command in Miami, overseeing military operations in Latin America for 3 years, making him also the longest-serving U.S. combatant commander in recent history. He then held the position of Supreme Allied Commander of NATO for 4 years, from 2009 to 2013, overseeing operations in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, the Balkans, as well as anti-piracy operations off the coast of Africa. During his career in the Navy, he served as senior military assistant to the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Navy, as well as heading the Navy's premier operational think tank, Deep Blue, immediately after the 9/11 attacks. He has published 6 books on leadership, Latin America, ship handling, and innovation, as well as over 200 articles in leading journals. Dean Stavridis is chair of the board of the U.S. Naval Institute, and he's also dean of our very own Fletcher School, where he plays an integral role in molding bright young minds to become leaders in their fields. Former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates described him as one of the most forward-thinking military thinkers and enlightened leaders of his generation. He won the Battenberg Cup for commanding top ship in the Atlantic Fleet, the Navy League John Paul Jones Award for inspirational leadership, and more than 50 U.S. and international medals and decorations. But I'm sure he can make room for one more. And so I'm proud to present the John Mayer Award to Dean Stavridis.
Well, thank you first and foremost for the Jean Mayer Award. I was a student here, as was mentioned, in the mid-1980s, otherwise known as 1.2 million years ago. And Jean Mayer was the president of Tufts. He was an inspirational leader. He was everything that you just heard about in that wonderful introduction and description. I think also you can drop a plumb line from Jean Mayer and his leadership to the leadership of our president today, Tony Monaco. When I was in the running to become the dean here, at one point the president shared with me that he was asked, well, are you sure you want to hire an ex-military guy to be a dean? And he said, well, what I really want is to have one dean who knows how to follow orders. So that's how I got the job. What I'd like to talk about today is, I think, kind of a riff on the title of the conference, which is Order in Chaos. What I'd like to do is spin it slightly and talk about challenges and opportunities. And I'm going to do that using a few images to kind of set the tone and set the point. And I'm going to take probably 20 minutes or so, maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll just open it up for some comments or questions about this extremely disorderly world we find ourselves in. And I want to begin, as I often do in talks, by saying, let's keep it in perspective. We're in a very dangerous world. We certainly see multiple challenges, and I'll talk about those. But how bad is it? Let's go back 100 years ago, just for a minute, because we're going to talk about the 21st century, but I want to start by taking you back 100 years ago. The world is in the middle of the First World War. The Battle of Jutland has just occurred. 10,000 sailors die at sea, 200,000 tons of ship are sunk. And this is really just the tip of a terrible iceberg in the First World War. This is the battlefield of Verdun, which also is just completing 100 years ago. At the Battle of Verdun, 1 million casualties. 1 million casualties. In our entire 10-year series of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, tragically, we've lost about 5,000 U.S. troops. This is 1 million casualties in a battle that lasts about a year. This is the First World War. And wouldn't it be nice to think that following that war, the world would have learned something and avoided the Second World War? Maybe that happened on some parallel universe, but unfortunately, the world came out of World War I, created a whole series of trade and tariff barriers around the world, cracked the global economy, led to the rise of populism in places like Germany, and created the Second World War. This is the Battle of Stalingrad, where in a 6-month period, 2 million casualties. One battle. This is the iconic moment in the battle where the Russian flag is flown over Stalingrad. So how did we do after that? Well, we actually seem to have learned something. We create a series of global institutions which do manage to keep a very shaky peace through the long twilight of the Cold War. We did it by creating a series of borders and boundaries between the West, a much smaller NATO, and the United States and our allies, and the communist world. But we can say at least we managed to preserve the peace although in the early 1960s we come, as is famously said, 5 minutes to midnight, almost to a nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's the 20th century. That's a bad century. You know, like, you can almost pick a number, but let's say it's roughly 60 to 80 million people die in 2 world wars, and we come within an inch of ending mankind. That's a really bad century. So everything I'm about to tell you is dark and disturbing and worrying, but we ought to keep it in perspective, because I do think, and here's my, as we say in the military, my bottom line up front, is that we do have the tools, I believe, the tools of diplomacy, the tools of science that people like President Monaco represent, the tools of governance. They're unevenly applied, fair enough, but we do have the tools, my view, to surmount the challenges. So with that, as a little bit of context, let's plunge into the challenges in this world. And I'm going to start with this terrible day, because I think it is kind of a break point. We have some wonderful midshipmen and cadets and other undergraduates who have presumably only the vaguest memories of this day. I put this here because it's seared in my mind, because my office was the little red circle. I watched the airplane hit the Pentagon. That's a bad day. And I will tell you, as I picked myself up after the explosion and tried to help the fire there, what ran through my mind was the irony of this moment, because I'd spent a lifetime in the military. I'd done a lot of dangerous things. I'd been in combat. I was a 1-star admiral at this point. Yet here I was in the safest place in the world, and I was almost killed. Think about it. I'm behind every concrete wall. I'm guarded by the strongest military on earth. I'm in the capital of the richest country on the planet. Was I safe? No. That's the 21st century. That's the challenge that we face. And it manifests with the rise of organizations like the Islamic State. This young man became famous 1 year ago in a place called Raqqa, Syria, because he dragged his mother into the town square and executed her, shot her dead. Why? Because she had attempted to convince him to leave the Islamic State. This kind of fanaticism, which manifests itself in a wide variety of settings, sometimes in the radical side of Islam, sometimes in right-wing nationalism. This is violent extremism that has nothing to do with Islam. This is upper right, Anders Breivik, handsome young guy, looks like a Gap model. 4 years ago, in a very peaceful, beautiful European country, Norway, he blew up the government house. This would be like blowing up the old executive office building right next to the West Wing of the White House, killed 7. Much worse, he then went to a political convention, much like EPIIC, young people between the ages of 18 and 24, and he killed 70 young people. Terrible day. Terrible day in any nation to lose 70 young, bright, vibrant people at what we would think of in the United States as EPIIC or boy state or girl state. I'd invite you to consider 70 dead in a country like Norway on a population-adjusted basis. Norway has a population of 5 million. That's a day in the United States where thousands of young people would have been killed. Nothing to do with Islam. So violent extremism, which we tend to associate with jihadism or radical Islam, is not only in places like Afghanistan and Libya and Syria, these sort of distant horrors. It exists in the most benign European countries. And how about right here? Racial extremism. This is Dylan Roof. He was just sentenced to death, I think appropriately, for killing execution style 8 worshipers in an iconic African-American church. Upper right, that's who we should remember, not Dylan Roof. That's Reverend Pickney. member of the state Senate of South Carolina, incredibly upstanding person. This is racially driven violent extremism. So my point is, you can think about this as a manifestation of violent extremism, which occurs in jihadism in the Islamic world, in right-wing nationalism. Upper left here, by the way, that's Anders Breivik in court. He was captured, incarcerated. He's apologizing. He's apologizing to the forces of right-wing nationalism for not having killed more people on that day, or even here. So this kind of violent extremism cuts across borders, ideologies, nations, and we ought to be very concerned about it. We ought to particularly focus, I think we should, on the Islamic State because they're expert at raising funds. They're expert at creating this sort of macabre theater of torture, rape, and violence, which they videotape. They're masters of the strategic narrative. The good news is we're pushing against them steadily, but they have long reach. This is just over a year ago. They take out a commercial airliner carrying tourists flying from Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, back to Russia. Paris attacks, very well known in the West, less well known, roughly the same period in Lebanon. They destroy a marketplace, killing almost the same number as in Paris. This was the Christmas before last. San Bernardino, California, 8 dead in the United States. Turkey, a frequent target. Every 2-3 weeks, a significant incident. Most recent here in the United States, last summer, spring, Orlando, Florida, Pulse nightclub. So the reach of this organization, I think, will continue long after we conclude operations in Mosul, which will happen in the next 3 to 4 months. We'll move on to Raqqa. We'll clear them out of Raqqa. But that kind of global scope will continue. And they have a plan, and this is the plan. It's to create a caliphate. Now, look at Spain. I don't think Spain is going to be called Andalus anytime soon, but when an organization is this venal, this evil, has that kind of global scale and reach, can raise funds, and continues to proselytize and recruit quite effectively, we ought to be concerned. We also ought to worry about some nations that tend to live on, shall we say, the borders of international law. One of them is Iran. This is the flag of Iran. Fortunately, we've concluded a diplomatic agreement that I think will prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon over the next 7 to 10 years. That's a good thing. I don't think we should walk away from that deal, and I don't think the Trump administration will walk away from that deal. But we ought to remember about Iran how they view themselves. And here's a point for all of our students as you study international relations. The most important thing is to be able to put yourself on the other side of the table. That means knowing the history, knowing the culture, knowing the language, and empathizing with those with whom you disagree. If you put yourself in the shoes of Iran, this is their mental map. It's the Persian Empire. Now, they're not consciously trying to recreate a Persian Empire, but they see themselves as a powerful, near imperial power in that region. And I'll simply point out 2,000 years ago, and by the way, these are the battle flags of Cyrus the Magnificent and Darius the Great, alongside the Iranian flag. 2,000 years ago, the Iranians, Persians, controlled 80% of the world's population in that space. They see themselves in that way. We need to understand that if we're going to effectively negotiate and deal with them. So we ought to be concerned about Iran. And of course, what happens in Iran has a backdrop of Sunni-Shia disagreement. Shia led by Iran, Sunni led by Saudi Arabia, that's the Saudi flag there, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and parked in the middle of it is our closest friend and ally in the region, Israel. So this is a complex corner of the world. We ought to think about it and construct a plan to deal with Iran without resort to combat. I think we can do that. It will be challenging. Is Iran the most dangerous country in the world? No. It's North Korea. Why? Because North Korea has a young, untested, untried, unpredictable leader. His name, by the way, is Kim Jong-un, because he's unpredictable, untried, and untested. It's actually not why it's on. He is dangerous because he has all the qualities I mentioned. He already has nuclear weapons. He has about a dozen. And increasingly, he has the ability to deliver them at range. Not quite yet, but think of those as two streams that are approaching each other. One is miniaturization and the ability to deliver a nuclear weapon at range, and the other is the nuclear weapon itself. When those streams cross, it'll be like in Ghostbusters. You don't want the streams to cross. And that stream, those streams will cross in the next 2 to 3 years. So this is big casino for the Trump administration. We also ought to worry about Syria as distinct from the Islamic State. We have a brutal dictator who we should hope will end up dying in a jail cell in The Hague. Or he may end up in a dacha in Russia. Or he may end up running Syria for another 20 or 30 years. We'll see. What I do know is that his policies, his violations of international law, his execution killings, his torture, his use of chemical weapons, his use of barrel bombs are leading to this. Waves of refugees. Europe has absorbed well over 1 million. At the moment, there's a little bit of a break pause because Turkey is working very hard to hold large numbers of refugees, as well as other frontline states like Jordan, Lebanon. Probably 7 million Syrians have fled the country, and another 7 million are out of their homes. Think about the United States in that context. That would be a world in which 50 million Americans are in refugee camps in Canada, 50 million are in Turkey, and everybody to the west of the Rocky Mountains is displaced from their homes. It's an apocalyptic scenario. So Syria will continue to absorb a great deal of attention and challenges. We also have an ongoing significant dispute in Ukraine. I believe last year the EPIIC conference focused on this challenge. It continues to this day. I can show you a very benign map here, right? This is Ukraine. Here's what Ukraine looks like. It's a war. It's a war in Donbass, in the southeast corner of Ukraine. And people are dying. And there's a Minsk process that President Putin has pulled out of. Negotiations are not working very well, and we're going to continue to have a significant challenge. And part of our problem is that we tend to think, here's the strategic terrain of Ukraine. Nope. The strategic terrain is right there. Lesson 2 about international relations. In the end, it's personal. Personality matters. It's not always the bottom line, but more often than you would think, the great driving issues of a nation are shifted and changed because of an individual. So we have to understand Vladimir Putin better than we do if we're going to solve this and figure out how not to stumble backward into another Cold War, which we do not need. What else should we be concerned about? In this particular space, I would say something called hybrid warfare, which our cadets at West Point are looking at. I suspect our midshipmen are probably beginning to think about hybrid war at sea, which will be the next wave of this. And hybrid warfare is not massive waves of tanks and airplanes and troops marching. It's small numbers of troops, special forces, computer-driven cyber war, use of social networks, use of propaganda, use of fake news. All of this is kind of a witch's brew, which I think is part of this challenge as well. What else? We ought to be a little worried about this. This is Afghanistan, where we tend to have kind of walked away from that in terms of our focus. because instead of having 150,000 troops, which is what I commanded in Afghanistan, today we're down to 15,000. It's come down 90%. We still have a terrible problem with narcotics. What crop is this? Poppies. This creates heroin, which is eating up New England today with addiction. We've got to spend time thinking about how to deal with these kind of transnational challenges as well. What's going on in Asia? First of all, a recommendation, a book. This is Asia's Cauldron by Robert Kaplan, who's one of the terrific geopolitical writers of our time. One-stop shopping, highly readable, walks you through the rise of China. I don't think we're on a collision course with China. I don't think we're going to end up in a war with China. I think we will bump heads with China in the South China Sea. I think we have significant disagreements about some of their work in the cyber world. But I think overall, here's a world in which we have the diplomatic and the economic tools to work through. We should worry more about the environment than we do. We see a global melting in the North Pole. And I'm not a climate scientist. We've got Dr. Paul Berkman here, who is on my faculty. He's an expert on the Arctic. If there are any hard questions, I'm going to have him answer them. But what I will tell you, I'm not a scientist, but I spent my life as a mariner. I've sailed these waters. The ice caps are melting. You know, we can have an argument about why and how fast, but they are melting, and that's going to shift geopolitics. We also ought to worry about pandemics. Every 100 years, the human species tends to undergo a significant pandemic. 100 years ago, what was it? Spanish influenza, Spanish flu. 40% of the world's population infected, 20% mortality rate. Think about that. And we're due. The top here is Ebola. That's patient 0, upper right, who died in a Dallas hospital here in the United States, and Zika, which we still do not quite understand. Pandemics are part of the backdrop of security as well. So as I wrap up this kind of set of challenges, you might be thinking, wow, that's a lot. People would ask me when I was a NATO commander, what did you worry about the most? Was it Afghanistan or Syria or the Balkans or piracy? What did you worry about the most? What I worried about the most was cyber. These are the flags of Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Georgia. All have undergone a cyber attack in the last 5 years. Our electric grid is vulnerable. We see the Ukrainian electric grid practically blinking on and off like a Christmas tree light. Cyber is real as a significant challenge for us. And I'll give you an example of how small nations can use cyber as an equalizer. This is the flag of North Korea. 2 years ago, this movie came out, The Interview. Anybody see this? It's a terrible movie. I mean, terrible. In fact, when I decided I would talk about the movie, I thought, well, as an act of professional diligence, I should actually watch the movie. I made it through about 14 minutes, and I had to turn it off. But somebody found it not very funny. That was Kim Jong-un. He found it unfunny, and he decided to unleash his cyber dogs against Sony Pictures. U.S. corporation, by the way, did tens of millions of dollars of kinetic damage, and I would argue hundreds of millions of dollars damage to stockholders by the release of emails, which damaged brutally the credibility of Sony in this entertainment space. So my point is, big nations can attack small nations with cyber. Big nations can threaten each other in cyber, and small nations can attack big nations in cyber. That's why cyber is so insidious. So all of this has a geopolitical backdrop, which is Brexit and the pulling apart of our best pool of allies in Europe, and the ongoing stress of the euro on the economic system in Europe and therefore globally. And what's our problem here? Gridlock, which I predict will get worse. I think it's unlikely that the present situation of the Republican Party holding the presidency, the House of Representatives, and the Senate will continue over the next 5 to 10 years. I think we're probably headed back to the kind of political gridlock we had under President Obama. Worse, we are in a psychological gridlock in this country right now. And I think that is, in many ways, our most significant problem. All of that, everything I've described to you this morning has a tendency to lead to this, an idea that somehow it would be better if we pulled out of the world, if we came back to the United States, if we tended our garden here. It's a seductive idea. Isolationism is a very seductive idea for the United States because we're, frankly, so well equipped to be isolationists. We're protected by two huge oceans. We have benign, weaker neighbors to the north and south. We have an enormous internal economy. We tried this once, right? We tried this in 1919 when we walked away from the League of Nations. We erected walls. They were called the Hawley-Smoot tariffs, and the global economy cracked, and it led into World War II. I think history doesn't always repeat itself, but it certainly rhymes. And I would say we ought to be very cautious about this idea of just coming home. So right about now, you ought to say, okay, Dean, it's quite a list. You've made me nervous. What do you think? What should we be doing? What are the opportunities? You mentioned opportunities, right? Challenges and opportunities. So far, it's all challenges. Let me give you a few opportunities. And I'll start with one that may surprise you because most audiences right about now, they think the next slide that's going to come up is going to be a U.S. Navy aircraft carrier coming right out of the screen. No, I think the most important thing we can do is this. It's listen. Listen to each other like you're doing here at EPIIC, to our friends and allies to understand where they are, and maybe most importantly, to listen to our opponents. We can do a much better job of this. And this, by the way, is not Photoshop. This is an actual Belgian air defense system from about 60 years ago. He's listening for incoming aircraft. I showed this photograph in Germany where they're kind of sensitive about NSA listening. And the first question I got was, Admiral, is that one of those early NSA listening devices? I said, no, this is a metaphor. We should listen more. Step one. What else? We should treasure places like the Fletcher School, like Annapolis, like West Point. We should treasure the Naval War College down in Newport, where we stop, we read, we think, we listen, and we build intellectual capital. That's the most powerful weapon we can have. So all of you who are in that younger cohort, I'd encourage you to graduate, obviously, and go out and practice your craft, whether it's driving a destroyer, leading a platoon, working at Goldman Sachs, going to the Peace Corps. Practice your craft, then come back to a place like this. Come to the Fletcher School or some other lesser school of international relations. There are many. But find time in your life for the continuum of education. It's a powerful part of creating security. What else can we do? Hey, we need to do this. We need to hold on to our values. What are they? Democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of education, gender equality, racial equality. We execute them imperfectly, but they're the right values. And they come to us, I'm Greek American, I'm allowed to say it, from ancient Greece, through the Romans, Cicero. That's the young Voltaire on the right, the Enlightenment, our own founding fathers, to leaders like Angela Merkel, who I would argue is the most principled global leader today. Values matter deeply. That's kind of lesson 3 in international relations. We push them aside too quickly on occasion. What else? We can learn languages. How many people here speak a second language, as in can conduct a meeting in a second language. That's an extraordinarily high number. And I would expect it in an audience like this, at a school like this. In the United States, 8% of the population speaks a second language fluently. That number is rising rapidly with the rise of the Latino population, but we are a nation that does not invest enough in language. This is the Rosetta Stone, the universal translation, and this on the right is a young Canadian corporal in Afghanistan teaching himself Pashto. I put the picture there to make the point, so much of learning a language is actually self-instruction and self-motivation. Take time to learn a second language. Here I'm really speaking to the young people. What else can we do? We can read. We can read. Schools like the Fletcher School are marvelous, but find time to read. Dereliction of Duty about the war in Vietnam by the new National Security Advisor, possibly the greatest trade-up in National Security Advisor history, going from General Flynn to General McMaster. I know them both quite well. He wrote that book when he was in graduate school, earning his PhD at UNC Chapel Hill. He's a defense intellectual as well as a warrior. Black Flags. You want to understand the rise of ISIS. This book won the Pulitzer Prize this past year, an extraordinary book. Rules of the Game about the Battle of Jutland, Thucydides, etc. Point is, read, read, read. I know you're already reading a lot. Here I'm talking about 2 years from now when you're in the Peace Corps, when you're in the fleet, when you're deployed forward. Keep reading. And don't stop with the nonfiction. Read novels. Read novels. You can learn an enormous amount from historical fiction, for example. Gates of Fire, about the Greeks and the Persians in battle 2,500 years ago. Killer Angels, about the different modalities of leadership. Ender's Game, about cyber war. Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, about innovation. I am fascinated by the idea of fiction as a teaching tool for learning leadership. And so I just published a book about it, called The Leader's Bookshelf. There is so much to learn, there is so little time, but as you continue on that path of education in your life, always be reading. What else? What other opportunities are there? I would argue this nation remains an opportunity. We have our faults, we make mistakes as a nation, but we bring a lot to the table. Upper left, regardless of how you feel about the current president or the previous president, look at that photograph. That's President Obama at the G20. When the President of the United States speaks, people listen. That's political capital. It derives, upper right, from an economy that is not perfect, a lot of debt, deficit spending, but as a hand of cards, the economy of the United States, there is no other major nation that would not instantly trade with us. Bottom right, we have a professional, capable, experienced, and here's the key word, apolitical military. I think that will always be so, and it gives us leverage in the world. And then, bottom left, we're a young country. That's an enormous advantage. China is aging rapidly. Italy, Spain, the Balkans, the Baltics, declining birth rates. Real challenges ahead as a result. We're a young nation. And here's a news flash. Immigration helps us. Helps us. Do a few malactors come in? Sure. But time after time after time, the story of refugees and immigrants is a success in this country. And I want to tell one story on that about a West Point grad. Who's here from West Point, by the way? I keep looking for cadets. You guys came in civilian clothes. Now I got it. So do any of you know a graduate of the class of 16 named Alex Adichie? He is a Haitian American. He graduated near the top of his class. And at West Point, on the graduation day, a photograph of him went viral around the United States because he was crying. He was standing there in those beautiful dress grays, crying on graduation day. Everyone else is like cheering and happy, and he's crying. And so the media tracked him down and said, "Why are you crying on this graduation day?" And he said, "Because I came here as a migrant, a refugee from Haiti in 2008, and now I stand here at West Point to serve the United States." Top of his class at West Point. That's the other face of immigration and refugees that we don't hear enough about. So I think the United States remains an opportunity. The interesting question is, for us, who are our allies? Certainly, part of our fundamental structure is NATO. I would argue in this 21st century, we, United States, ought to look to India as a potential significant partner. When the story of the 21st century is written, it will not be about the rise of China, although that's an incredibly significant achievement by the people of China. They've raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, but I think a greater story will be the rise of India. It's a democracy, many challenges, but it's the world's largest democracy, a true democracy. In their last election, 800 million people voted. Think about that. The United States, do you know how many people voted in our last election? We have a population of about 330 million. We had 100 million people vote, 50% turnout. India, 800 million people voted. This democracy, I think, is young and growing. It'll be a significant geopolitical player. We ought to find our way to the kind of relationship we have with them that we do with other staunch allies, like NATO, like Japan, like South Korea, like Australia, like New Zealand. That network of alliances is the most important geopolitical factor in the United States. What else? It's not just alliances, not just formal alliances. We also need coalitions. This is the coalition against the Islamic State. And you see a lot of our traditional allies in that map of flags. But you see other nations, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, who are part of this coalition against the Islamic State. So it's formal treaty allies, it's coalitions, and it's friends like India. That's how you build a global network, and I think that is an enormous part of creating security. What else? Do we need a capable, strong military? Yeah, we do. Here's the picture of the aircraft carrier, by the way. I knew you were waiting for it. We spend about 3% of our GDP on our military. It's a lot of money. The American people expect a lot. And I think they get it. And I think if you think of 3%, you think in your own portfolio what you spend on insurance, it's a pretty good return on investment. What is interesting about our military is how it will change over the next decade. Here's another terrible movie, by the way, Ender's Game. It's a brilliant novel, terrible movie, that happens. This is about cyber. I think our capabilities will be not only these gorgeous platforms, but increasingly cyber, unmanned vehicles, and special forces. This is Michael Murphy, young Navy SEAL. Michael was killed in Afghanistan in 2008, where he became the recipient of the Medal of Honor. A terrific movie is called Lone Survivor. That's the story of Michael Murphy. I put him here to remind us that for all the high tech and the cyber and the expensive platforms, at the end of the day, some measure, some significant measure of our security is dependent on young men and women like Michael Murphy, like Alex Adichie, like the young men and women here. What else? Our military can do more of this, soft power, hospital ships. I often said I deployed literally dozens and dozens of aircraft carriers, ordered them forward in Southcom and EUCOM and as NATO commander. In many ways, the most significant deployments I ordered forward were these hospital ships. Hundreds of thousands of patient treatments creates real security by changing the impression of the United States. We can also do this. This is literacy training in Afghanistan, another remarkable example of soft power. And we can be better here. Now you're looking at this and you're thinking, okay, he's a retired admiral, these are sea lanes of communication, or maybe they're fiber optic networks, or maybe they're ICAO aviation routes. Nope. This is the world according to Facebook. The brighter the white, the higher the concentration of Facebook users. 1.6 billion people in this world out of 7 billion on the planet. It's a powerful, powerful place. That's the good news. It exists. The bad news is that our opponents live here. The Islamic State is here, proselytizing, recruiting, and conducting operations. We need to be more in this space. It's part of how we create security. So I'll wrap it up now, and then I'll open it up. You know, I've talked a lot about what might be called soft power this morning. The idea of listening more, of reading, of learning languages, of literacy training, of hospital ships and medical diplomacy. I believe in all those things. Control of the strategic narrative, that's soft power. I would not want anyone to leave here doubting my belief that we do need hard power. This is a Tomahawk missile. It's being launched from a Aegis cruiser. This is a weapon so accurate we can fly it 1,500 miles from here to Chicago and decide whether to fly it through that door or that door. We're very good at this. We're very good at launching missiles. We need to get better at launching ideas. So last thought for you, and it's this balance between hard and soft power. You know, at the end of the day, we're not going to negotiate a settlement with the Islamic State. Not going to happen. We're going to find them, and we're going to eliminate them. But the long game of creating security is on the soft power side. It's education, opportunity, diplomacy, listening, literacy, all the soft power tools. The point is, you need both. You need to know how to dial in that rheostat. And if you can do that effectively as a nation, you're not using hard power or soft power, you're using smart power. Thank you for spending so much time with me this morning. I appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Let me, thank you. It's very kind. Thank you. I would love to take a few questions and answers. I see I've run on a bit, but I am, let me just ask anyone to step up, raise your hand. I think it's small enough. You can just speak from your seat if you would like. Yes, sir.
So you talked a lot about these ideas of listening, of the opportunities
Right.
that you take. And I guess the problem that I see is that if we do all the listening and we do all this reading and gather all this knowledge, it seems kind of moot if none of these types of people can't be, say, elected to an office or can't be the people that are actually making the decisions that enable us to activate some of these soft power or different channels of diplomacy. So how do we get around that caveat?
Yeah.
That seems to be a hurdle.
Well, it's a terrific question. We live in a democracy, and in 1840, Alexis de Tocqueville, who was a French aristocrat, came to America to write a book about this new phenomena, democracy. And he wrote a book called, creatively enough, On Democracy. And the bottom line of the book is, I think, instructive. It's largely a laudatory observation of our chaotic, approaching Jacksonian democracy. But one of his conclusions was that the tragedy of democracy is that in the end, you elect the government you deserve. So I'd turn that question around. to the electorate. And I think we all spend a lot of time in chat circles these days bemoaning one side or the other of the political spectrum, deeply concerned about it. The answer is activism. The answer is being involved. The answer is people like you deciding now that you want to be involved in campaigns and that over time you want to participate in this political process and not become disillusioned with it. And here at Tufts, I feel that highly. And I think that is where we must place our hope. And what people my age can do is talk about it. I spent a lot of time giving this talk in a lot of places around the world. You can see a version of this on TED. If you Google TED Stavridis, you'll see a kind of a 5 years ago version of this. You need to tell this story. So those are the two weapons in the quiver, I think. And both of them are part of democracy, but both of them can be challenged. And so if we're going to connect this kind of idealism, if you will, with real pragmatic policy, we need our young people to be the bridge to do so. Thanks. Yes, sir.
Yes. Good morning. I'm Minh Ding, a member.
Could you speak closer to the mic?
Yep. Good morning. I'm Minh Ding, a member of the EPIIC class.
Great.
So I would like to thank you for your great speech and, if I may say, very informative slides.
Thank you.
So now there have been a lot of comments saying that the liberal democracies are collapsing, such as with the Brexit, the rise of nationalism, and if I may say, the recent elections. So how should the U.S. tackle this challenge that comes from within itself and within its own allies?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great question, and of course, very au courant, of the moment. And I think it kind of relates to the question here. So if I can just sort of bank the first part of my answer, which I think applies to this, and then I'll just make a pragmatic observation, which is we're in a tactical moment that appears to show some significant movement in some places toward more of a right-wing populism. I think personally it's too soon to throw in the towel on the Western liberal order. I spent last weekend in Munich, Germany at the Munich Security Conference. There's a lot of nervousness, but I think if we look at the long throw of events, as Martin Luther King Jr. used to say, where does the moral arc of the universe bend? I think it bends not only to justice, which he said, but I think it will continue to bend toward democracies. And my evidence for this would be first empirical. If you look at the last 200 years, just go back 100 years ago. How many democracies were there in the world? A handful. What percentage of the world lived under democratic rule? Very small percentage. Where are we today? Enormous change in the last 100 years. When I graduated from Annapolis in 1976, if you look south to Latin America, you saw 27 nations, 26 of them under military dictatorship. Now today, arguably, they are all free nations with the exception of Cuba, down to one. So I think empirically it bends that way. And then secondly, back to values, I think as I see, for example, the Arab Spring, which is, a misnomer if there ever was one, but what's the wellspring of that? It's a desire for freedom, it's a desire for liberty, it's a desire for expression. I'd bet that way. Nothing's certain, and nothing ever is in geopolitics. But I think both empirically and intuitively, I'll continue to bet on the Western liberal order, despite some tactical changes. And I'll close by saying in the United States, I think the current populist move is solidly, incredibly well supported by 35% of the population. I think the current administration's approval ratings are right now about 36%. I think that's an instructive empirical point as well. So I would say don't count out, but be cautious, and as to this gentleman's comments, count on the youth. Thanks. Next.
Thank you very much.
And if I could just have really quick, short questions, and I'm going to give a couple of really quick, short answers because I know we want to keep moving. I'll go right back and forth. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Winona. I'm a junior at Tufts University studying international relations and computer science. So the cyber portions of your speech were very informative.
Thank you.
I would like to ask, though, because it is a relatively new emerging issue in the wider international sphere, where you believe cyber warfare fits in the grander U.S. military strategy.
Yeah, excellent question. I would say, as I mentioned, it's the thing I worry about the most, Winona, because there is the greatest mismatch between level of threat, which is quite high, and level of preparation, which is low. In other words, all the other things I talked about, Islamic State, our concerns about Iran, North Korea, Syria, very concerning, but we're pretty well prepared. We spend a lot on defense, we can handle it. Cyber, not so much. So I'll give you three things we should do. We should create a cyber force, just like we have an Army, a Navy, an Air Force, a Marine Corps. We need a cyber force. I think we need one very quickly. 100 years ago, we didn't have an Air Force. Why? Because we were right at the beginning of aviation. We need a cyber force quick. Number two, we need greater cooperation between private and public sector. So much of cyber is both defense and indeed offense is going to happen in the private sector. And number three, we absolutely need to split the National Security Agency from U.S. Cyber Command. Those are two separate organizations. They should be. Currently, they're merged under one military officer. We should split those two. There's about 12 more things I could say, but I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excuse me. I'm a cadet at the United States Military Academy, and I'm actually a member of the CTC there, the Combating Terrorism Center.
Right.
And just so everyone's like on the same page, there's single-issue terrorism, which is where like the ALF, Animal Liberation Front, where they want the protection of animal
I'm going to
rights.
ask you to move right to a question. What is your question?
So one of your solutions, which I agree with most of them, you say listening. Well, with like religious terrorism, such as ISIS, they quite frankly want the change of the whole world order.
Right.
So they don't really care as to what happens. They want their motivation. So how do you go about listening?
Yeah, I think in those cases, let's think of it, let's divide it into thirds. I think in a religiously driven insurgency or movement, and there are terrific studies on this. I'd commend Max Boot's book, Invisible Armies, to you. Roughly 1/3 of the people will be absolutely impossible to convince. Don't bother listening, don't bother talking to them, find them and kill them. About 1/3 of them are easily winnable with education, opportunities, alternative path. In the middle is a group that's kind of trade space. That's where we need to put more effort. So you need hard power to deal with the first third. Soft power is going to be more effective, certainly with the second third I mentioned. And I think over time, if you don't lose your patience with the middle third, you need both. Thanks. Quick question.
Good morning. My name is Thiago. I'm a member of the Brazilian delegation. And in your first answer, you mentioned that Cuba is the only country in Latin America that is not a democracy.
Yeah.
But I was wondering about the Venezuelan situation also. And I would like to know how challenging can be the actual situation of Venezuelan government to the security for Venezuelan people and also for the region like South America and the Caribbean region.
Now, this is a wonderful question. I think Venezuela is probably one step behind Cuba as at best, a quasi-democracy. And the reason it's a quasi-democracy is because the executive branch, if you will, President Maduro, controls every level of power, including the judiciary, the military. Incredibly, he's let the legislative branch get away from him. That's why I still categorize it as a democracy. There's an elective legislator in opposition to him. How it comes out, boy, I think it's 50-50. It could go very, very badly. Brazil's doing, I think, terrific work trying to engage diplomatically, and I think at some point our best hope is that, I'm making this up, but Colombia, Chile, and Brazil form a negotiating group, a G3 that goes in and negotiates a solution between Maduro and the opposition. But it could go very badly, very quickly. How does it affect the United States? Not terribly. We do derive a great deal of hydrocarbons from Venezuela, easily replaceable from other sources. So this is a case of the real tragedy. People used to ask me about Chavismo and President Chavez. Is he a threat? And I would say, Yeah, he's a terrible threat. He's a threat to the people of Venezuela. He's no threat to the United States, and neither is Maduro. The threat is to the good people of Venezuela.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. My name is George. I'm from Russian delegation from Russian Presidential Academy of
good.
Public Service.
Excellent.
I would like to ask you one question about also in the continuation of cyber warfare. The first confirmed cyber operation was, if I'm not mistaken, at the beginning of the 21st century, and it was against Iran, against his nuclear capability.
I can neither confirm or deny.
Yeah. Well, we don't know who was, but it was someone who was against an enemy
Certainly
of Iran,
there's
so
a
maybe
lot
it
of-
was Israel or...
Yeah, sure.
So, but we don't know. So I just want to ask you the question whether you consider this operation the beginning of cyber warfare or not.
I think that cyber warfare began long ago. I would argue, as if we think broadly about cyber, it probably begins in World War II with the insertion of coded mechanical devices into analog systems involving cryptology and a number of other cases. Certainly, the use of cyber as a tool of espionage has been endemic throughout the entire Cold War. In terms of an actual attack using cyber to perform-
Infrastructure.
to conduct kinetic damage, I could give you some earlier examples, but I don't mean this facetiously, they are classified. But I would assure you that, and I think your point is, this cuts both ways, and there are examples of the United States conducting cyber warfare. There are examples of Russia conducting cyber warfare. There are examples of China, North Korea, Iran, et cetera. It's a very fair comment, and I completely accept it.
Thank you.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. Nope, I'm going to let that midshipman ask a question, so it's going to be 3 more. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Quick question. One here, one there, one here, and then we're done.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Alon from the Israeli delegation.
I'm sorry, which delegation?
The Israeli delegation.
Israeli, thank you.
Yes. So I have a question regarding to our issues, actually.
Okay.
You were talking about reconciliation and talking. With rivalries and so.
Right.
And we have a deadlock in Israel regarding the Israeli-Palestinian issues,
Yeah.
especially regarding to the Gaza Strip right now. We need a kind of solution actually over there, that's for sure. And we can't conquer the Gaza Strip, it will lead to nothing, and we can't reconcile with the Hamas.
Right.
Do you have any advice maybe?
Yeah, don't we all wish we had a quick answer to that question? I'm going to hang on the two-state solution because I think that's in Israel's interest in the long term because of the demographics. If you have been listening closely to the presentation, demographics underline a lot. Demographics are destiny for nations. I think that drives you to a two-state solution. So the question is how you implement it. I was with Bougie Allon, who is the former defense minister of Israel. He kind of edges toward a two-state solution, but one that is kind of longer term, that creates a Palestinian Authority that gradually gets more and more authorities while renouncing violence, moving away from Hamas. I think that's probably the best you're going to do. The idea that there's going to be a sudden epiphany and a really quick deal, and that even someone as smart and capable as Jared Kushner, wife of Ivanka, is going to go over there and suddenly solve this. I hope it's true. I think it's highly unlikely, so I think strategic patience and unwavering support of the United States for Israel, which I think matters a great deal.
Thank
Yes,
you.
sir.
Oh, hello, Admiral. I'm Kyle from the Brazilian delegation as well, but I'm also Brazilian Estonian. So you've been to Munich, you met President Ilves, great guy. So
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, what do you think is the path for small nations like Estonia to face hard power if they're not able to count on NATO and the U.S.?
Yeah, well, the path for any small nation in the history of the world is to maneuver intelligently and gain alliances and protection from larger nations. I believe NATO's Article 5 guarantee is real. I've had this conversation with President Ilves, with your brilliant Chief of Defense, General Raiho Terras. I know Estonia well. I think I would also say continue conscription, continue to have everybody serve in the military. be ready for challenges, both psychologically and kinetically, but above all, alliances. Short answer to the question. That's a wonderful background to be Estonian, Hanseatic, and Brazilian.
With a Spanish passport.
Wow. Fabulous. Okay, you get the last question, and you see those little stars she's wearing above her anchors on her uniform? That's the superintendent's list at Annapolis, which means she's in the...
So thank you very much for letting me ask the question, and I don't probably, need the praise that you are giving me, but I wanted to thank you for your speech. We heard something similar at the Naval Academy, but it's really good to remind ourselves of the points that you make. And I got to the end of your challenges piece of your speech, and I was wondering, oh my gosh, there's so much to do, and how on earth are we supposed to tackle all these challenges? And obviously, you gave us several opportunities for us to really engage and make this world better.
Sure.
But at what point, especially as the young people in this room are going into our careers, how do we know that our careers are worth investing in? And at what point do we have to take a step back and say, okay, I need to invest in a new area?
It's a wonderful question, and I think the nature of your generation is going to be one of trying different things and doing different things, and that's just a reality, and they may be dramatically different, and it's because you have such a rich banquet hall of opportunity ahead of you. It'll always be an intensely personal decision, whether to make a sudden jump shift in your career, but I want to close this session on the idea of service, because one thing I know for sure is that service matters. And people say to me a lot in my old age, Admiral, thank you for your service. And I appreciate that, and here's how I respond. There are a lot of ways to serve this country, and one way is what you're doing, and the cadets are doing. Another terrific way is in the Peace Corps. Another way is in AmeriCorps. Another way is in Volunteer for America. Another is working in a clinic. Another is working at a school. Another is tutoring. There are 1,000 ways to build service into your life. I would argue being an educator is a career of service. So I don't know how to tell you when to change over, but I will say to anybody who's young, there is no better way to make your life meaningful than to serve and serve others. So I'll close to all of the people here by saying thank you for your service. Thanks. It's been a pleasure being with you. Thank you.
Thank you to Dean Stavridis for that fantastic keynote address, and thank you to the audience for attending. We're going to take a quick break, I think, for lunch at this point, and then we'll reconvene later.
Good